The coffee shop sat quietly at the edge of a busy street. During the day it was alive with people rushing in and out, carrying cups as they hurried to work or school. But at night, once the city lights dimmed and the evening crowd disappeared, the cafe changed. It became calm, almost like a secret place where time slowed down. She worked the night shift there, and though most evenings were uneventful, she had grown to expect the quiet company of one man. He came almost every night, always around the same time, always ordering the same cup of coffee. She noticed him first because of his silence. Unlike other customers who often chatted loudly, took phone calls, or scrolled endlessly on their phones, he would come in, give a small nod, place his order in a calm voice, and then walk to the corner table by the window. He would sit there with his cup, sometimes looking out at the empty street, other times watching the steam rise from his coffee. He didn't bring a laptop or papers. He didn't even glance at his phone much. It was as if that simple coffee was the only thing he needed. At first, she thought he was just a man with a routine. Maybe he lived nearby, maybe he liked the peace and quiet. But the more she saw him, the more curious she became. There was something different about him. He carried himself with a quiet strength, as if the world outside expected a lot from him, yet here he could let all of it go. His clothes were simple, but they looked carefully chosen. He never dressed like someone showing off, yet there was an air of refinement she couldn't explain. Every night, she greeted him with the same smile and he returned it with a polite one of his own. Their conversations were short, just about the coffee or the late hours. Still, she found herself looking forward to those little moments. He had kind eyes, ones that seemed to carry both calmness and a weight she couldn't quite name. She worked long shifts, often feeling invisible behind the counter, but when he looked at her, she didn't feel invisible. It wasn't that he stared or said anything extraordinary. It was the way he paid attention, even in those brief exchanges. He listened, even when all she said was, "Here's your usual coffee." It made her wonder who he was when he left the shop each night. Sometimes she tried to guess. Maybe he was a writer, finding inspiration in the stillness of the cafe. Maybe he was someone who had no family at home and simply came for company, even if he never said much. Other nights she thought perhaps he was running away from something, though his face never showed fear, only quiet. Her co-workers teased her once, asking why she always looked across the shop when he came in. She brushed it off with a laugh, saying it was just habit. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't just habit. There was something about him that stood out in her otherwise ordinary nights. One evening, when the rain tapped gently against the cafe windows, he arrived as usual. His coat was slightly wet from the drizzle, and he shook it lightly before hanging it on the back of the chair. She served him his coffee and noticed the faint smell of rain mixed with his cologne. For a moment, she thought about how lonely it must be to sit alone every night, sipping coffee with no one waiting at home. Yet, she didn't dare ask. What surprised her was how consistent he was. People usually came and went, sometimes stopping by once, then disappearing. But he kept coming back. Night after night, without fail. It was as though the cafe had become part of his life, part of his routine that he couldn't let go of. And she wondered if, just maybe, it was not the coffee he came for, but the feeling of being in a place where nobody demanded anything of him. There was one small thing she began to notice after weeks of watching. He often looked at the door as though expecting someone. When the door remained closed, he would sigh softly and take another sip of his drink. She caught that detail one evening and it stayed in her mind. Who was he waiting for? Or was he simply hoping for something he knew would never happen? Despite her growing curiosity, she respected his space. She didn't pry. She didn't try to start conversations beyond polite words. Yet, in the quiet of the cafe, she began to build a picture of him in her imagination. A man who worked hard in the day, perhaps dealing with things too heavy to share, who found comfort in the small corner of a coffee shop at night. A man who seemed strong on the outside, but lonely on the inside. The truth, though, was far from what she imagined. She didn't know that he wasn't just another customer. She didn't know that behind his quiet visits lay a life filled with pressure, responsibility, and hidden pain. To her, he was just a man who came for coffee every night, but to himself, he was more than that. He was a father, a leader, and someone searching for a place where he could just be human without titles or expectations. As the nights continued, she grew used to the rhythm. The sound of the door opening, his calm footsteps across the floor, the way he placed his order without needing to say much, and the gentle nod of thanks he always gave her. It became part of her own routine, something that brought comfort in its consistency. And though she had no idea who he really was, she felt a sense of connection, even in the silence. She never imagined that this simple beginning, this quiet exchange of coffee and smiles, would one day lead to a story that would change both of their lives. At that moment, she was just the barista, and he was just the quiet man at the corner table. Yet, beneath that surface, life was weaving a path that neither of them could see coming. The nights continued to pass, and with every visit, the man at the corner table seemed a little less like a stranger and more like someone familiar. She found herself waiting for the sound of the door, the quiet footsteps, and the soft smile that appeared when he ordered his coffee. He never rushed, never acted impatient, and never carried the heaviness of someone demanding attention. Instead, he blended into the quiet atmosphere of the cafe, yet his presence was strong enough to change the way the place felt. One evening, the cafe was emptier than usual. The rain outside had kept most people at home, and only a few customers had come and gone. By the time he entered, she was wiping down the counter, humming softly to herself. He approached as always, but that night, instead of just giving a nod and ordering, he spoke a little more. "You seem to enjoy the quiet," he said, his voice calm, almost thoughtful. She looked up, a little surprised. "Yes. Nights like this feel peaceful. The rain makes it even nicer." He nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "It does. It makes the city seem softer, like it's finally resting." The words stayed with her. They weren't just small talk, they carried a depth she hadn't expected. It was as though he saw the world differently, not just through busy schedules and crowded streets but through feelings and moments. For the first time, she realized he might not just be sitting there for the coffee. Maybe he came for the silence, the space to breathe, and perhaps even for the simple conversations that asked for nothing in return. That night, after bringing his coffee, she found herself staying near the counter longer than usual. They exchanged small observations about the weather, the cafe, and even the books on the shelf nearby. Though the words were simple, the exchange felt different, like a bridge being built, slow and steady. From that evening on, their conversations began to grow. Sometimes he would ask her how her day had been. Other times, she would share small stories about the cafe or her studies, since she worked there part-time while trying to finish her degree. He listened attentively, as though every word mattered. Unlike others, he didn't interrupt or drift away into his phone. His attention was complete, and she found it comforting. But she also noticed something else. He rarely spoke about himself. Whenever the topic leaned toward him, he gave short answers. If she asked about his work, he would say only that it was busy. If she wondered about his evenings, he would say he liked the quiet. And when she asked if he had family nearby, he simply smiled and said, "Yes, someone very important." Then he would fall silent, sipping his coffee as though the subject was too delicate to touch. It intrigued her even more. Who was this man who came every night, shared gentle words, yet kept his life so carefully guarded? There was kindness in his eyes, but also something hidden, a weight, a tiredness that lingered beneath his calm surface. One evening, near closing time, she walked over to wipe the table beside his. He looked at her, and for the first time, his expression carried a trace of hesitation, like he was deciding whether to speak. "Do you ever feel," he asked slowly, "that life moves too fast, and you barely have a moment to catch your breath?" She looked at him, surprised by the question. "All the time. Sometimes I feel like the world expects too much, and I'm just trying to keep up." He gave a soft laugh, though there was little joy in it. "Yes. Exactly that." Then he grew quiet, staring into his cup. She wanted to ask more, to know what he meant, but she sensed that pressing him might close him off again. So instead, she said gently, "Maybe that's why places like this matter. They give us a chance to pause." He looked at her then, really looked, and his eyes softened. "Yes. That's why I come here." The answer settled into her heart. He wasn't just a man with a habit, he was someone seeking something deeper. She didn't know what it was, but she felt honored that he chose her cafe for it. Over the next few weeks, their connection grew in small but meaningful ways. Sometimes he would help her carry heavy boxes of supplies when the delivery came late. Other times, he would wait by the counter after paying, just to share a few extra words before leaving. She began to notice the way his face relaxed when he spoke to her, as if the weight he carried became lighter, even if only for a few minutes. One night, as she cleared the cups, he lingered by the door. She expected him to leave, but instead, he asked quietly, "Do you ever wonder if people really see you? Not just your smile or your job, but you?" The question struck her deeply. She nodded slowly. "Yes. Sometimes it feels like I'm invisible. People walk in, grab their coffee, and go. But every now and then, someone notices. That makes a difference." He gave a small, thoughtful smile. "It does. It makes all the difference." That conversation stayed in her mind long after he left. She realized that beneath his calm exterior, he wasn't just lonely, he was longing to be seen, to be understood, just as she sometimes was. It created an invisible thread between them, one that neither of them spoke about, but both felt. Yet still, she knew almost nothing about his life outside the cafe. He never mentioned work beyond calling it demanding. He never spoke about friends, and when he did talk about family, his words were brief and careful. But there was one moment, one night, that gave her a glimpse behind the mask. He had been quieter than usual that evening, staring at his cup longer, barely touching his coffee. She asked gently, "Is everything okay?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he said softly, "Some days are harder than others. But I remind myself why I keep going." His eyes clouded with emotion, and then, almost as if he regretted saying too much, he gave a polite smile and changed the subject. It was just a small slip, but it told her more than he realized. Whoever he was, whatever he carried, he wasn't just a man with a simple routine. He was someone holding on, someone who had reasons to endure even when the days felt heavy. She didn't push further, but in her heart, she began to care. Not in a dramatic way, not like in the stories where strangers fall instantly in love, but in a quieter, deeper sense. She wanted him to feel that the cafe wasn't just a place for coffee, but a place where he mattered, even if he said little about himself. Little did she know, her presence was becoming the reason he kept coming back. Every night, her smile, her gentle words, and her simple kindness reminded him that beyond his world of responsibilities, there was still humanity, warmth, and connection. And while she wondered who he truly was, he knew that revealing it too soon might change everything. For now, he was content to simply be the quiet man at the corner table, sharing small conversations with the girl who didn't see him as anything more than human. The weeks rolled by quietly, and by now his visits had become more than just routine for both of them. She had grown so used to his presence that on the rare nights when he didn't appear, she felt a strange emptiness. The cafe seemed quieter, the hours slower. And when he did arrive, something inside her relaxed, as though the night had returned to its natural rhythm. But she also noticed more details about him. Small things she hadn't paid attention to before. There were nights when his shoulders seemed heavier, as if the world outside had pressed down too hard. Other nights, his smile carried warmth, but his eyes revealed a tiredness he couldn't hide. Though he never said much about his life, his silence spoke louder than words. One evening, the cafe was nearly empty, and she decided to gently ask him more. After serving his usual coffee, she leaned slightly against the counter and said, "You always look like you've had a long day." He chuckled softly, though the sound was faint. "That's because most days are long." "Work?" she asked carefully. "Work," he confirmed, pausing for a moment. "And life?" There was something in his tone that made her pause. It wasn't just the voice of a man tired from a job. It was the voice of someone carrying more than one role, more than one responsibility. She wanted to ask more, but she saw in his eyes that he wasn't ready to share. So instead, she smiled and said, "Well, I hope the coffee helps a little." For the first time, his smile deepened. "It does. More than you know." That answer stayed with her. More than you know. It made her realize that these late-night cups of coffee weren't just about habit. They meant something deeper to him, something she couldn't yet see. A few days later, something unusual happened. As he reached for his wallet to pay, a small photo slipped out. He quickly picked it up and tucked it back, but not before she caught a glimpse. It was of a little boy, no older than 7 or 8, with bright eyes and a wide grin. "Your son?" she asked softly, not wanting to intrude but unable to stop herself. He froze for a second, then nodded. "Yes. My son." His voice carried both pride and sadness at once. "He looks sweet," she said gently. "He is," he replied, and for the first time, his face lit up in a way she hadn't seen before. The love in his eyes was undeniable. But just as quickly as it appeared, it faded, replaced by a shadow of worry. "Does he live with you?" she asked cautiously. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's just the two of us." Something in her heart softened at those words. She suddenly understood why he always carried that air of quiet strength mixed with exhaustion. He wasn't just a man working long days. He was a father, raising a child alone. She wanted to ask what happened, why it was just the two of them, but she didn't. She could see that he wasn't ready to open that door. Instead, she simply said, "He's lucky to have you." He looked at her, as though searching for any trace of pity in her words. But all he saw was sincerity, and his shoulders seemed to ease just a little. "I'm the lucky one," he whispered. That night, he didn't stay long. But as he left, she realized she had seen a side of him she hadn't before. He wasn't just a man escaping into the quiet of the cafe. He was a father, balancing love and responsibility, carrying the weight of both roles on his own. After that, she noticed more hints. Sometimes, when he checked his phone, his expression softened with affection, and she guessed it was messages from his son. Other times, when he seemed distracted, she imagined it was the endless responsibilities of parenthood. She began to admire him not just for his calm presence, but for the strength it must take to live that life quietly, without complaint. One rainy evening, he came in later than usual. His coat was drenched, his hair damp, and his expression heavier than she had ever seen it. She quickly prepared his coffee, and when she handed it to him, she said softly, "You look like you've had one of those days." He sat down, staring at the cup in his hands. After a long pause, he said, "It's not easy, you know. Being everything at once. A provider, a protector, a teacher, a friend. Some days I wonder if I'm doing enough." His honesty startled her. For the first time, he was letting her see behind the mask. She walked over and placed a napkin gently on the table. "I think just being there for your son is already more than enough." He looked at her, his eyes glistening slightly, though he blinked the emotion away. "I hope so. He deserves everything. And sometimes, I feel like I fall short." She wanted to tell him he didn't, that the love in his eyes whenever he mentioned his son spoke louder than anything else. But she simply said, "He's got a father who comes home every night, who loves him enough to worry about being enough. That already makes you more than most." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy but meaningful. Then he gave a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. From that night onward, their bond grew stronger. He didn't reveal everything, but she could sense more of his truth with each passing day. The way his shoulders dropped slightly when he sat down, as though finally resting. The way his smile grew softer whenever she mentioned family. And the way his words carried both weight and warmth, like someone who had lived through storms but still found beauty in small moments. She had no idea that outside the cafe, he was someone the world would recognize instantly. A man with wealth, power, and a name that carried weight in business circles. To her, he was simply the quiet man with a kind smile and a hidden story. And perhaps that was why he kept coming back. Because in her cafe, he wasn't the CEO, the millionaire, or the figure people demanded so much from. He was just himself. A man, a father, and someone who wanted to be seen without judgment. She didn't need to know his title. She didn't need to know about the empire he managed during the day. All she saw was the humanity in him, and all he wanted was the peace of being seen that way. What neither of them realized was that this fragile connection born from coffee, small talk, and quiet moments was about to become something far deeper. Life had a way of revealing truths when least expected, and soon, the walls he built around his identity would begin to crumble. But for now, in the warm glow of the cafe, it was enough that she saw him not for what he had, but for who he was. The days moved steadily, and her life began to carry an invisible rhythm tied to him. She woke, worked, studied, and lived through her routines, but her nights had gained a new meaning. Each evening, she found herself wondering what kind of mood he would be in, whether his smile would be soft and easy or shadowed by worry. And every time he walked through the door, she felt a small comfort settle over her. She had grown to know his patterns. The way he always chose the corner table by the window, the way he wrapped his hands around the warm coffee cup as though holding it grounded him, and the way his voice lowered when he was tired but rose ever so slightly when he spoke of his son. She began to picture his life, though she still only knew fragments. A father raising his child alone, someone carrying heavy responsibilities, someone who seemed to value silence more than words. But soon, the world outside the cafe would show her a piece of him she had never imagined. It happened one morning, not during her shift but while she was walking to class. A newspaper stand caught her eye, and there, on the front page, was a face she recognized instantly. She stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping. It was him. The same man who sat every night in her cafe, the man who drank his coffee quietly and listened with gentle patience. But here, he wasn't sitting in a corner table. He was standing in front of cameras, dressed in a suit, his hand raised in a polite wave. The headline read, "Reclusive CEO Balances Business Empire and Fatherhood." Her eyes widened as she read the first lines of the article. It described him as the head of a massive company, someone who had built a reputation not only for success but for avoiding the spotlight whenever possible. The article mentioned his late wife, his devotion to his young son, and the way he often chose to live quietly rather than flaunt his wealth. She couldn't believe it. The man she thought was just a kind stranger was, in fact, someone whose name was known across the city, maybe even the country. A millionaire. A CEO. A single dad carrying not only the weight of parenthood but also the pressure of leading thousands of employees. Her heart raced as she folded the paper back. The discovery changed everything and yet, somehow, changed nothing. He was the same man who smiled at her from across the cafe counter, the same one who asked gentle questions and shared small truths. But now she knew why he carried that weight, why his eyes sometimes looked so tired, and why he seemed to guard his life so carefully. That night, when he walked into the cafe, she found herself looking at him differently. She tried not to stare, but it was hard to reconcile the two images: the powerful CEO in the newspaper and the quiet man sitting in her shop. When she brought him his coffee, she hesitated before placing it down. He noticed her pause. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. She nodded quickly. "Yes, of course." But her voice was a little unsteady. He looked at her for a long moment, as though sensing something had shifted. Then, with a sigh, he said quietly, "You saw, didn't you?" Her eyes widened. "Saw what? The papers? Or the news?" His voice carried no anger, only resignation. She nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. I I didn't know. You never said." He smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. "I didn't want to. Not here. Not with you." "Why?" she asked softly. He leaned back, his gaze falling to the coffee cup in front of him. "Because out there, I'm always the CEO. The man with money, the man with answers, the man people look at for what they can take. But here," he paused, then looked up at her, his eyes tired but honest. "Here, I could just be a man. No titles. No expectations. Just, me." His words struck her deeply. She realized then why he had chosen her cafe night after night, why he had kept his life so guarded. It wasn't about hiding from the world, it was about finding one corner of it where he didn't have to perform. "I understand," she said quietly. And she meant it. He studied her face for a moment, as though waiting for judgment, for the change in her eyes that he had seen countless times before when people discovered who he was. But it never came. She didn't look at him as the CEO, the millionaire, or the headline. She looked at him the same way she always had, like he was a man sitting in a cafe, drinking his coffee, sharing his humanity. Relief washed over his features. "Thank you," he whispered. From that night on, something shifted between them. Their conversations grew more open, though still careful. He began to speak, little by little, about his life. About the endless meetings, the weight of decisions that affected thousands, the pressure of being seen as strong even when he felt fragile. He spoke about his son, the joy he brought, the laughter that filled their home, but also the fears of not knowing if he was enough as a single parent. She listened, not as someone impressed by his wealth or title, but as someone who saw the man beneath it all. And for him, that made all the difference. One evening, he admitted softly, "Sometimes I wonder if I've done the right thing. Building a world so big when all I really want is something simple. A quiet life with my son. Nights like these." She smiled gently. "Maybe that's why you come here. To remind yourself that simple things still exist." He looked at her then, his eyes softening, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more. But instead, he just nodded. As their nights continued, she realized something important. The truth of who he was hadn't created a wall between them. It had created a bridge. Now, when she watched him sit in his corner, she didn't just see a customer or even just a father. She saw a man who had carried so much yet chose to share a piece of it with her. And though the world outside the cafe might never understand, within those walls, their connection had become something quiet but unshakable. Two souls finding comfort not in titles or appearances, but in the simplest of things: a cup of coffee, an honest word, and the knowledge that someone finally saw them for who they were. The nights at the cafe no longer felt ordinary. For her, each evening carried a quiet anticipation, not of something grand or dramatic, but of the simple joy of knowing he would come. For him, each visit was no longer just about escaping the pressures of his world. It had become about finding something he had been missing for a long time: genuine connection. Now that the truth about who he was had been revealed, the air between them should have changed. It often did with others. Usually, once people discovered his identity, their eyes shifted. They either looked at him with admiration or calculation, measuring what they could gain. But here, with her, nothing had changed. She still greeted him with the same smile, brought him his coffee with the same care, and listened to him with the same warmth. She saw not the CEO, not the millionaire, but the man who sat alone in the corner with weary eyes and a heart full of love for his son. That was what kept him coming back, night after night. And though their conversations never strayed into promises or declarations, something unspoken grew between them. A bond made not of titles or wealth but of humanity and kindness. One evening, the cafe was especially quiet. The street outside was hushed, and only a handful of customers had come and gone. He arrived as always, but this time he looked more relaxed. His shoulders weren't as heavy, and his smile came easier. After she brought his coffee, he lingered at the counter instead of walking directly to his corner table. "Would you sit with me for a while?" he asked gently. She blinked, surprised, but nodded. It was late, and no one else was waiting to be served. She carried her own cup and joined him at the table by the window. The street lamps outside cast a golden glow through the glass, and the rain from earlier still left streaks on the panes. For a moment, they sat in silence, sipping their drinks. Then he spoke softly. "You know, I never thought I would find a place like this. A place where I don't have to be anyone but myself." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Maybe that's what everyone needs sometimes. A place where they're just seen as human." He smiled, his eyes warming. "And you gave me that. Without even knowing who I was, you gave me something I didn't realize I needed." Her heart stirred at his words, not because of who he was, but because of the honesty in his voice. "It wasn't hard," she said quietly. "You're easy to see when you let yourself be." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Most people don't see past the surface. They stop at the title. But you," he paused, his voice dropping. "You never looked at me like that." She lowered her gaze, feeling a warmth rise in her chest. "Maybe because I never needed to." The quiet stretched between them again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken understanding. Outside, the street remained calm, while inside, two people shared a moment that neither of them would forget. As weeks turned into months, their bond grew steadier. He continued to come to the cafe every night, and she continued to serve him with the same kindness. Sometimes their conversations were light about books, movies, or the little joys of everyday life. Other times, they dipped into deeper waters, where he shared the struggles of raising his son, the pressure of leadership, and the loneliness that often came with both. She listened without judgment, offering comfort not with solutions but with presence. And in return, he offered her something too: the assurance that her simple kindness had meaning. That being herself was enough to touch someone's life in a profound way. One night, he spoke more openly about his son. "He's my reason for everything," he said, his eyes soft with love. "Some days I'm afraid I'll fail him. But then he laughs, and it reminds me why I keep going." She smiled, touched by the tenderness in his voice. "From what I can see, you're not failing him at all. You're giving him love. And that's what matters most." He looked at her then, with gratitude in his eyes. "You remind me of that. Every night I sit here, you remind me of the simple things that matter." It was in those quiet nights, with nothing more than coffee and conversation, that their connection deepened. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about being seen, truly seen, and finding comfort in that. Eventually, his son became a part of their story too. One evening, he brought the boy with him. The child had the same bright eyes she had glimpsed in the photo, full of curiosity and joy. He sat at the table, swinging his legs as his father ordered coffee and a hot chocolate for him. She greeted the boy with a warm smile and placed the drink in front of him. "Your dad talks about you," she said gently. The boy grinned. "He does. All the time," she replied. The father looked at her with quiet gratitude, and she realized that this was no longer just about two people meeting in the stillness of the night. It was about something larger, about family, about connection, about building something real beyond the walls of the cafe. As the months unfolded, the cafe became more than just a place of escape for him. It became a bridge between his world and hers, between the life he lived under pressure and the life he longed for, one of simplicity, honesty, and warmth. For her, the experience changed something too. She realized that even the smallest gestures, like serving coffee with a smile, could touch a life more deeply than she ever imagined. She saw firsthand that no matter how wealthy or powerful someone appeared, at the heart of it, everyone longed for the same thing: to be understood, to be valued, and to find connection. And so their story found its quiet resolution. Not in the form of sudden drama or sweeping declarations, but in the gentle unfolding of trust and companionship. He no longer came to the cafe simply to escape. He came to belong. And she no longer saw him as just the quiet man in the corner. She saw him for all that he was: a father, a leader, and most of all, a human being searching for the same things she was. In the end, it wasn't the money, the titles, or the headlines that mattered. What mattered was the coffee shared, the words exchanged, and the bond built in the stillness of the night. And every time he walked into the cafe, both of them knew they had found something rare. A connection beyond titles, beyond appearances. A reminder that even in the busiest of worlds, two souls can meet over something as simple as a cup of coffee and change each other's lives forever.